Halloween and the zombie central banks. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Alex on a special Halloween edition of Insights, talking all about zombies. What more could you ask for? I'm very excited about this. We actually missed recording this yesterday, but we'll take the opportunity today because it was such a great article. So how are you going today, Alex?
I'm going well, and I'm glad we got the Halloween special in because zombies are pretty interesting, especially this time of year.
It was a great metaphor. I really loved reading that yesterday. And I think we'll continue along with that metaphor a little bit today just to really dig into it because it really worked quite well. So let's start off. You talked about zombies in the article, specifically this idea of zombie companies and zombie banks. So can you begin maybe by telling us what they are and what you were talking about there?
So just starting with what a zombie company or a zombie bank is defined as, it's basically an entity that a zombie company is a company that needs bailouts to operate, or an indebted company that is able to repay interest on its debt, but not its principal. So if you think about it, remember the car companies operating in Australia, they're ultimately zombie companies because they needed government support to continue operating, although they were pretty profitable, but that doesn't matter. That's a here nor there. And, you think about the banks that get bailouts at the moment in the US, they're all ultimately zombie companies now. They cannot operate in a normal market without some sort of support.
Yep. And we've seen that. Well, I suppose that's an interesting aspect to talk about because how wide is this, if we talk about as a zombie apocalypse, how wide is this around the world? We've got that Australian example. Is it an isolated thing that we're just seeing here? Or is this, is it a worldwide outbreak that we're seeing of these situations where companies are zombies? They're not really able to do it themselves.
Well, as you can understand, if interest rates go up, it's harder for a company even to pay the interest on its debt. So worldwide, we know interest rates are going up. They're going up in the US, Australia, Europe, everywhere. Well, except for Japan, but maybe today we'll see how that all goes. So you've got so many more zombie companies. In fact, the KPMG article that came out the other day said that they're up at about 51% in 6 months. So of the 2,400 zombie companies, that are on the ASX, 5.3% of them are now zombie companies. That's 127 companies that would ultimately therefore have negative equity.
Yep.
So it is increasing, and it will continue to increase with interest rates.
And it's also the banks, isn't it? Because you were also talking about this idea of zombie banks as well. It's not just those companies, it's also the banks. I suppose that's because they're funding those companies. Is that how that works?
Well, I mean, in the US, for example, if some of the banks, like, give me one that collapsed 6 months ago.
Like Silicon Valley and all
Silicon
of those.
Valley. Yeah. So they had bought treasuries. The treasuries dropped in value. They lost the cash that they had in deposits. And they became zombie companies because their equity dropped and they couldn't operate, in a normal market. They're just negative equity. So there's lots of them. It can happen to banks because of loans. So you've got all the commercial loans in the US. I think the default rate, I'm not going to get that one right, but it's increasing significantly on commercial loans. So any banks right now with huge amounts of commercial loans are probably zombie companies as well. So it's companies, it's banks. And today's idea around the zombie article is they've now started talking about zombie central banks, not
that's
banks.
where I wanted to head next, because is that where this ends up? Is it that is that the cause of the disease, right? If we're using this metaphor, is that the disease behind all of this? What the mechanics of the actual central banks and the role that they've been playing, are they the ones that are really spreading this contagion?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the article concluded that it actually comes from zombie governments because they are overtaxing and not covering their debts. So they're just increasing deficits year on year. The US borrowed over $1 trillion in the July to September quarter. They're looking at borrowing $759 billion in the October to December quarter, and then I think it's 861 billion for the January to March quarter. It's increasing. So, that is ultimately the root cause of this. You've got central banks that are trying to control this fiscal craziness with monetary policy, which is spreading the contagion, because they're having to be forced to lift interest rates to have monetary contraction, because there's fiscal expansion coming out of the governments. But it's just creating more and more bankruptcies, more and more zombies. And, take it down to the individual level, there's more, more and more people that can't pay their mortgages anymore. So it is rippling through the economy right now.
And that's a really good point, because we often like to point sort of the finger of blame at the central banks here. And you're highlighting, in many ways, they're just responding probably logically to the real master zombie there, the government. So that does make sense, right? And often we're quick, and the government's certainly going to be quick to point the blame somewhere else, but it really does settle at the seat of government.
It does. The
Yeah.
IMF brought out an article on Australia today or yesterday, where they're saying that basically RBA quick increase the interest rates more. So they're encouraging it. But they're also saying they're being forced to do it because of the fiscal spending coming from the bank. Now, I don't agree that interest rates should go up anymore. I see that there's no choice, but you are punishing the 30% of people and companies right now in Australia that have debt, and not punishing it, and not fairly, putting the burden across everyone in Australia. It is a very poor way to operate the punishment. But then you've got this fiscal spending that is adding to the inflation. And that was what the article from the IMF spoke about, how it's the fiscal spending that is creating all of this. And then they spoke about, no one likes this, but it makes more sense, potentially increasing GST rather than increasing mortgage, interest rates, because that's at least a fairer spread across the economy, which does make sense. But no one wants to pay more tax, especially when it's recklessly spent like it is right now. There's no way of getting ahead, because it's just deficit after deficit.
That's a really good point as well, because I certainly don't like the idea of the GST going higher. That was always the argument, 10% cap, that's all it's ever going to be. But when you start talking about raising the GST, then the focus comes back onto, well, hang on, if we're raising it, what are we spending that money on? Maybe even the threat is necessary in a situation like this, which is kind of what the IMF's doing. The threat to just say, look, guys, you need to either raise these taxes or rein in the spending, because at the moment, no one likes the idea of the tax raise, but there's no real pressure on government to rein in the spending, because there's never any pressure on a government to rein in spending.
Controlled by monetary contraction and just more bonds. Like it's insane. Like the definition, let's go back to that, is a company that cannot support itself without intervention, or it's just paying its debts. So look at the US. They're worse than a zombie. They can't even pay the interest. They're getting to the point that they're not even paying their interest on their debt without going further and further into debt. They have had 1 year of surplus in 23 years. Yeah, like it's crazy. 2001, I think that was it.
I don't know what's worse than a zombie, but you make the point. Like it's a valid point. Yeah, and particularly hearing the IMF sort of criticizing Australia there, and you go, well, you could throw a lot more criticism elsewhere as well.
I think they did. I think about 6 weeks ago, didn't they? Well, they did come out and say that the US spending was the worst thing in the world right now. So they've definitely pointed it appropriately. You go back to, how this all started. In 2008, there were so many bankrupt companies, there were so many zombie companies back then that were allowed to happen. And rather than killing them, we let them multiply. And every time you drop the interest rates, they multiply to the point where the interest rates get so low that companies that perhaps shouldn't be zombie companies at 4% interest rates suddenly become zombies. So a company that's operating at 1% debt and can pay that, and it goes to 4%, well, they're bankrupt. But maybe the 4% rate company should never have gone bankrupt, but it becomes a domino effect because you're forced to do it, lift it so quickly.
So let's wrap this up with the metaphor, right? Like the ultimate question here, how do you kill a zombie? Does it come down to, in this case, we've got to stop the companies that are falling into that zombie status, the banks, the central banks, the governments, like you're talking about zombie governments? Do we have to try and take them all out at once? It seems like almost an impossible war to win here. What's your summary of the best approach to this? Do we approach it all, or do we really just have to put that pressure back on the government?
2008 was the opportunity to silver bullet this, and it wasn't taken. Now we're in a situation where you've got mass inflation, and to me, probably monetary still needs to stay tight, but fiscal is the big thing that needs to be reined in here. You've got Jerome Powell saying it, you've got the IMF saying it, you've got everyone saying it, but governments, when they come into an election, or they need to not be in a recession like Australia is right now, 1.2% GDP, being band-aided by 5% migration, or whatever that number is. Like, there's too many band-aids just to tick boxes. And to me, fiscal's the only way. Well, I've said that for ages.
Yeah, we need that flush out of the system that can only come from government restraint. So all I'm hearing there is good luck. Good luck fighting this zombie apocalypse.
When's the next election? Who else is going to go bankrupt before them?
Yeah, no, that's sobering thoughts, but presented in a fun way. So you get the best of both worlds. Thank you for that, Alex. Really enjoyed that today. Lots of fun there on a topic that really isn't fun at all, but what can you do?
It's just going to keep going. But anyway, we'll see what next Halloween brings and what other ghouls and ghosts come out then.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for watching. Remember, reach out with any of those questions or comments on the social platforms. That's us for today. We'll be back with Sam tomorrow to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the day, everyone.